I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, but like I don't know if you've seen his viral original TED Talk. He talks about, that people buy what you like, why you're doing it, not the what you're selling. And that needs to come with storytelling. So even when I think about when I work with my teams we're selling solutions to clients, it do it in a storytelling approach, so to bring people along the journey with them. And going back to my commenter, and like, people do business with people they like, trust, and want to do business with. Well, what starts to build some of that connection with people? That's storytelling, that's commonality, and none of that's going to come out unless you start to openly share it.
Victoria Pelletier is a 20-plus year corporate executive, board director, #1 selling author, and professional public speaker. Nicknamed the Turnaround Queen and the CEO Whisperer by former colleagues and employers, Victoria inspires and empowers her team and clients to change mindsets and drive growth in business, leadership, and culture. We dove deep on the one thing she would change about corporate strategy, how a modern compensation structure can drive growth and improve a company's culture, and what corporate America should do to attract and retain top young talent. Enjoy our conversation. Victoria, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to welcome you from Miami. Would love to move down there one day, but we'll settle what we have for now. But here's where I want to start. So you're a really accomplished woman, have done a lot in corporate America, and have done a lot in speaking, and have really helped a lot of people kind of reach the next level in their lives and their careers. But I want to run it back a bit. So I know early on you had a very difficult time growing up. What do you remember from your childhood?
It's interesting, Daniel, and that a lot of people don't have memory beyond usually like age 6 or so. For me, I think because it was fairly traumatic, I have pretty significant memories. And I share the story openly. I'm sure your audience is going to go, "Oh my God," when I start to tell you this. But I describe my early beginnings as a big part of my why, my driving force to be who I am today, to do more, to do better. So with that, I'm born to a drug-addicted teenage mother who was exceptionally abusive to me. Pushing me upstairs, downstairs, carelessness. This one wasn't intentional, but a cigarette on my eye, so I wore a patch for a number of months. I thankfully was removed from her care in that she often would give me to a couple that she had met after an episode. And after a few of these incidents, the woman who later became my adoptive mother asked to adopt me. And so Julie, my biological mother, did probably one of the most selfless things she could have done, which was agree to give me up for adoption. So that certainly created walls. It hardened me. I was this tough little kid. But I continued to deal with adversity, everything from being ostracized for my adoptive parents' lower socioeconomic position to the fact that I developed extremely quickly. Like, I was taller than my teachers by the time I was 10, fully developed. So I got lots of attention for that, to being sexually assaulted at 14, to just a series of like other challenges and adversity that have come my way, including in business. So when I said earlier, I use that as my why. I have learned how to be exceptionally resilient. I had to learn how to do it in a more healthy fashion. But that has been really what has propelled me. I have become determined I would be better than biology or the circumstance that I was born and raised into.
So just to touch on one of those things, you mentioned that you were adopted. I know you said that even going through the adoption, still on a lower socioeconomic scale, but what was it? What was the difference like between going from really your, biological mother, where, had very unfortunate circumstances, to going towards, your adoptive mother? I'm sure there were other sets of challenges, but kind of, was anything different? Did anything, propel you to make any progress at a young age?
My mother, and my mother's the one that raised me, was this incredible woman who, she fought for me my entire life, not just to ask to take me out of the situation with Julie, fought for me in like school. I was gifted. And so she pushed hard for me to have all the testing and all of those things too. I don't think I realized it, certainly in my teens when she did it the most, and I hated it. When she would sit me down and force me to be really like self-reflective, talk through. She'd be like, Tori, let's talk about why you're acting this way. Why are you feeling this way? And I hated that moment for hours where we'd sit and talk, and she'd force me to be really self-aware, self-reflective, and then try and come up with a plan on how to address those things. I don't think I really embraced that way of being, and what I now refer to as healthy resilience. That is one of the key steps, I believe, to being resilient in a very positive way. And so I think she taught me that. Again, I didn't really embrace it probably until my late 20s. But that's now become a very, very key part of how I move forward and, in all of life, including, from a business perspective, in terms of being really self-aware and then starting to model the thoughts, the actions, the behaviors to make progress.
So, speaking of resiliency, one of the things that you mentioned, what would you say is the main difference between, an unhealthy resiliency and a healthy resiliency?
I think the ability to, many people have dealt with like significant trauma or adversity in their life, but I think that difference between unhealthy and healthy is that self reflection and self awareness, and also having taken the opportunity to process that trauma. I think the unhealthy version is just having walls up around ourselves all the time, just not letting anything hurt us. And this sort of living life with a survival goal in mind. And don't get me wrong, that's our most basic goal, is survival, but I
That
don't
crosses
personally.
all lines, all beliefs, all politics. We all just kind of want to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, so I think healthy resilience is learning how to bring those walls down, how to still be incredibly emotional and deal with the challenge that comes, but learning that we have choice in terms of how we're going to respond to that. And part of that choice means processing, and learning how to move forward in a more positive fashion and not continuing to play the victim.
I think unfortunately a lot of us do have trauma, and practically speaking, as life can be really, really unfair at times. I think we live in a society that unfortunately there's this stigma for whatever reason around processing or kind of dealing with stuff. Why do you think we have that kind of stigma, and what can we really do to try to get around that?
Um, It's hard work, by the way. The sheer amount of tears and emotions that, come through working through that is hard. And taking accountability for ourselves, and not talking about the event or situation that's happened. Many of those things are outside of our control. Much of mine definitely was, but it's hard to take control of the emotions and how we're going to move forward towards having a positive outlook or towards whatever the goal or objective we've set for ourselves. I think it's easier not to deal with it, to push it to the side, to compartmentalize it, and or blame others for it.
Fair enough. So one step at a time, dealing with it, and just knowing that it's okay regardless of what others may say.
Yeah.
So, on another note, before I get into some of the corporate career stuff and a lot of the hot topics I want to touch upon, earlier on, I know you mentioned we talked about you had this difficulty, and as you were advancing, you had your mother fight for you just to be able to kind of, put you in the right place at the time. Early on, did you have any idea what you wanted to be when you grew up, or were you just kind of going with the motions?
No, I totally knew, and I'm not in that role today. I from probably age 11, thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and this part will date me, and you might not know the show, but my mom watched the TV series L.A. Law, and so I would watch that with her, and it was this TV drama series about a group of lawyers. And so I remember watching that, and I'm like, yes, that's what I like. I want to do. So from age 11 onwards, I was determined. Corporate or criminal, I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah.
And so even when I went to university, you have to get an undergrad first. But I took some pre-law courses. I even took Latin because I thought it would help me with like the language of law. But then I worked through at a bank while I was in university, all throughout university, and got promoted very quickly. And I loved the leadership role that I was in. I loved the work that I was doing. So I remember moving cross country, and I'm originally born in Canada. I got relocated across the country to Toronto, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to take a year off before going to law school. And if I love Toronto, I'll stay and I'll go there. Otherwise, I'll move back out west. And that I would. I still plan on going to law school. So I never went to law school, never moved back out west because I fell in love with like the corporate world and stayed there ever since.
You know, it's funny. You mentioned you didn't know corporate or criminal. These days, there's probably a lot of intersection between the two.
Yes, especially the latest news headlines.
Yeah, a lot of stuff going on, but we'll leave that for another day. So you mentioned that you wanted to be a lawyer, but you ended up pursuing this corporate path, and you worked at a bank throughout college and ended up advancing very quickly, and you actually became an executive at 24. So candidly, I'm 25. I'm 25 as an entrepreneur, so maybe that's like I'm on a bit of a different path, but as an executive, you're overseeing a lot of different people, and there's a lot of responsibility and visibility. How'd you deal with all that pressure at a young age?
It was a lot. I think I'm not a big fan of the whole fake it till you make it, with one exception when it comes to confidence. And so that's one thing, even when I didn't have it, I always showed up with. And I think that's a big part of the reason why I got recruited into it was a chief operating role for a private outsourcing organization. And they wanted me because I had banking experience and they had large banking clients, and large contact center operational experience, which is what I had been leading for two of the banks that I had worked for the 6 years prior to joining them. But I walked in and I don't love the phrase imposter syndrome, but that's probably the best way to describe it. I in that COO role, I had every function reporting to me except for finance. So
It's
learning
kind of ironic in a bank too, don't you think?
um, I didn't have. I came from operations experience at a bank to now private outsourcing organization that had
Got
banking.
it. Okay. Hmm.
So I walked in there, and so I think I also got the job not just because I had banking experience, contact center experience, and by the way, I started working at age 11. My first leadership role was at age 14. So even though, and then I worked through the bank into like director level before I got recruited out. I had actually lots of years of working experience. I always think I have this big person persona because I hit my height so young. So I always feel bigger than I'm only 5'8". It's like I'm not gigantic for a woman, but I did hit this height by the time I was like 10 or 11 years old. Um, and I showed up with confidence. But what I will say is I made some pretty big mistakes early on in my leadership. In that, in part because of my childhood and that I didn't have the healthy resilience. I showed up with walls. I also didn't want anyone to question why I was there. So I was the youngest by at least 2 decades. I was the only woman. And I should note, I'm part of the LGBTQ community. At the time, I was married to a woman. I'm now married to a man. And I have a trans child, but I'm still openly queer. And so for me, I was like, oh my God, I have all these things against me as the only one. And so for me, I showed up. I was all business all the time. I was definitely not going to show that I had any kind of vulnerability or emotions because I didn't want anyone to think there was like a chink in my armor and question me being there. So that like I said, I think some mistakes early on. I got a nickname as the Iron Maiden. And I subsequently had to make a massive pivot and shift and show up very differently.
Got it. I want to ask you about a few nicknames earlier, a bit more the corporate ones, so no worries on that. But I'm sure it was a really difficult time, and definitely another time we're living in now. But looking throughout your career, you've worked with some industry giants. To name a few: American Express, IBM, and Accenture. If there's one thing that you could change about corporate America, what would it be?
Um,
I know there's a list of like 30 probably in your head right now.
exactly. That's what I was just going to say, Daniel. It's like hard to pick one. I think um, what disappoints me the most, and I don't get me wrong, I understand the importance of our shareholders in these large public companies,
Hmm.
but these companies are not like focused on, I think in many instances, the long game. I used to quoting Simon Sinek's, the infinite game. And so there's this very short-minded way of looking at for quarter to quarter results, and doing that on occasion is fine. But what I have found in many of these organizations is that's just the way of being. And so we're sacrificing what I think are longer term client relationships, longer term business opportunities, because we're focused on the quarter to quarter results and connected to that. And so, I'm sorry, you might say I'm saying a number two, but the incentives drive behaviors. And so the two are very, very interconnected. So I think we need to be thinking very, very differently around the long game in business, and with occasional trade offs for short term results and the way in which we incent our people.
So I'm actually really happy you brought that up because I wanted to ask about an Instagram video where you actually mentioned the exact things that you just quoted about companies' incentives and about thinking them about companies thinking short terms. I also share this opinion. Regarding corporate America, I think a lot of times things are a little short term focused, and we kind of see the ramifications of that happening right now with. When interest rates were lower, everybody hired a bunch and they probably were a little too over optimistic. And now, unfortunately, you have tons of people losing their jobs, which, is another thing. But unfortunately, it seems like for a while, corporate America has had this culture of incentives and short term vision. What do you think drives that kind of culture?
Um, Board and CEO pay, sadly. I look at, uh, it's funny. I was listening to a podcast the other morning at the gym, and it was talking about the Ryanair, the discount airline in Ireland. And the board actually had said that if the CEO had doubled their value within 10 years, he would get $100 million bonus.
Mhm.
So that drives it, and from the top. And so, but I see it at all levels. Like, here's a really small example, and I I'm not breaking confidence as I say this. So I just want to be clear. I certainly will not name the leader, but when Arvind Krishna stepped in for Ginny Rometty at IBM as our CEO, one of the things he did, and it's good and bad, was tied executive compensation. One part of our variable compensation was tied into diversity targets and continuing to see us move the needle forward. That's good, but it can drive some poor behavior. I also don't like having to incent people for doing the right thing.
It's a
But
great,
what
it's a great, I admit, sorry to interrupt, but I like how you're admitting it's a gray area. It's something to concern, but it's something that needs to be thought about carefully.
right.
It's a tough issue.
So, I mean, the needle hasn't moved enough, so incent people to move the needle forward. But the opposite side of that coin, and I saw there was a peer of mine who wanted to move a member of my team, the only female leader. We had I can't remember if she was a direct to me, dotted to him, or vice versa, but she had the opportunity to move to a different role, and he wasn't going to let her do that because his diversity metric would decline and it would impact his personal performance, yet it stunted her ability from a career perspective. So that's the flip side of it, and where I think we need to be thinking through compensation models differently.
So, I'm certainly no compensation expert and definitely not my area of expertise. I just like asking really interesting questions. But, I'm curious from your perspective, if there was an ideal, I know there's probably practically no perfect answer to that, but in your mind, what would an ideal compensation structure look like, especially for those really senior executives?
Um, so the way most compensation models currently work, certainly for large publicly traded companies, is a decent bonus. And by the way, I've spent a number of years in management consulting. They pay exceptionally well, so it's hard for many people to leave. I've chosen to leave. But so it's a high base compensation, a large variable component that can range from like 30 to 70%, and then stock options, or restricted stock units that come to them. I don't disagree with that model. It's how we get to that, particularly the middle point around variable compensation. That's where I see behaviors being driven. So if we are basing executive compensation solely on sales, revenue, and profitability, we're missing a lot of the pieces internally that drive really poor culture, leadership behaviors. And so this is where I want to see a more balanced blend of metrics and key performance indicators that come into play for those leaders to achieve their bonus. So great that Arvind put in a small percentage of our comp was tied to diversity, but then things like, are you connecting it to employee engagement results directly for you and how you and your team would be rated? Some companies have that, some do not. But I wanted to see it at a much more like holistic level. Plus, one thing they're sometimes measure, it's just heavily skewed towards like sales revenue, and profitability on things like customer engagement, net promoter scores, and those kinds of things. But I see the game playing with that. We don't send out surveys for net promoter scores to those that we think are going to give us a poor rating. Well, okay, so there's a lot of game playing in all of this. I'd rather us like just be honest with ourselves and know what our actual true baseline is, and then set targets and reward ourselves for those across a like diverse set of criteria.
So, while obviously it could differ from company to company, it sounds like an ideal comp structure would have a balance. And that doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. I just mean taking into account, various factors, a balance of those internal initiatives. So those top line revenue, bottom line sales, and also, sorry, external initiatives, top line revenue, bottom line sales, and also internal kind of I don't know the best word. I don't want to say informal initiatives, but kind of internal benchmarks or internal initiatives to hit, and that really ensures a more long term approach as opposed to the current corporate model.
Hmm.
So speaking of corporate America and specifically among younger generations, and we're probably seeing a lot of news around Gen Z and kind of the younger generations in the workforce. You know, from my perspective, and I believe I'm Gen Z, it feels like a lot of the younger generations are losing interest in working in corporate America. So, on top of some of the things that we've just discussed, what do you think companies, specifically, big, large corporate companies, can do or can change to attract and retain the best young talent?
I think there has been a very large shift, and I don't know if it's all purely generational or in some cases situational. And
Sure.
this makes me feel very old when you say you're 25. My oldest son just turned 24. But I've spent a lot of time over the last number of years focused on human capital businesses, so working with leaders on their people strategies, et cetera. So it's a place I spend a lot of time. And the combo generational situational is the fact that I do think there's a culture now of the employees and very much like from millennials and Gen Z who want to be work for organizations that align with their purpose, where they see that there's an impact not only in terms of the product or service that the company delivers, but in the work they personally do. So I think it's important for leadership to help translate that, because sometimes when you're brand new, fresh out of college, you're going in there and you don't have the ability to see all of those things. So we need to translate as leaders. And also, there's a very different view than my parents' generation of boomers who looked at job security in a very different way than this current generation does. And job security is more defined by investment in my personal growth and development. And so recognizing that here's our business strategy today, here's where we're going in 1, 3, and 5 years. What are the skills that are going to be required for our workforce? And how are we going to bridge the potential gap that's going to come in investment in our people versus just going and buying new talent in 3 years from now? So those are the things that as leaders we need to be thinking very, very much around purpose, impact, development. And then I also think they expect something very different again than the generation of leaders I first entered the workforce, who were much more authoritarian. There wasn't this notion of authenticity and vulnerability and transparency. That's an expectation today.
So all really great points, and I do think that the older generations just had more of a, and I'm saying this word in an unpolitical way. I have to emphasize that a more conservative approach as opposed to kind of taking on risks and doing things. But I do think if corporations, I don't want to say advertise, but position themselves as more investing into someone's development as opposed to those short term views, we'll have a much better long term results. So to note to a lot of things that you just said. Moving toward, a few of those nicknames that I wanted to mention, I just want to hear kind of the stories around these. So, a few of your nicknames, you've earned the nicknames the Turnaround Queen and the CEO Whisperer. How'd you earn those monikers?
So turnaround queen. I've been a part of 40 merger acquisition or related transactions in my career. A few of them are companies I've acquired and divested of. Another like 15 plus have been for the companies that I've worked for. And the rest are in support of the clients that my team and I have managed over the years. So that comes with significant change. You're integrating. There's always synergy expectations in those. Plus, I am not a status quo girl. Never have been. I'm the type who will almost break stuff just to put it all back together again. And so I often get given like distressed markets or business units or client portfolios to turn them around. I had one a number of years ago where I came in and the company had said to me, they asked me in the 11th hour, like to take a different role than they were recruiting me for. And I was like, okay, well, and they said there had been this large client portfolio that had a bit of a troubled project. Well, it was more than a bit of a troubled project. Like the client team had, like, the client itself had let go 5 executives for it. I think the company I worked for probably wore a little bit more of the reputational damage. I think it was a joint issue. They didn't disclose all of that when I joined. And I was like, this is going to be a rebuild, like relationship and trust needs to be rebuilt with this client. And I said, it's going to take us at probably 24 months to see a return to growth, and was able to do it in between 15 and 18 months. So it's doing those kinds of things that have given me turnaround queen. CEO Whisperer was actually one of my like senior executives at Accenture that I worked for. I was recruited to help build out a CEO and board transformation business, having been a C-suite executive myself on multiple occasions, and working through these kinds of transformations. And the fact that I'm a no BS kind of person, I operate with radical candor. Unlike many in the management consulting world who just tell clients what they want to hear, I will not do that. And so one of my colleagues, gave me the nickname CEO Whisperer.
Yep. So I used to work in consulting, which is a story for another day, but it's definitely a risky business, but I'm happy to see that it worked out. But to touch upon one of the things that you just said, so you've said you've been a part of 40 M&A deals. Kind of a two-part thing here, but I'm sure you have a lot of experience kind of seeing how all the informal cultures merge, because ultimately that probably drives a lot of the potential success in a lot of these in these deals. Why do you think most mergers succeed? Well, sorry, why do you think some mergers succeed, and why do you think some mergers fail?
Change management, poor change management is one of the reasons for it failing a majority of the times. And the other is there's often someone that comes in and is accountable for all the project management. And so first of all, change management and project management are related but different. And so I see like a project management office just being tasked once it's done, where here's the physical things that we're moving and integrating from. There was system A and B. We're making a choice between one or two, or maybe there's a third, and we're going to move forward with that. We're going to choose this process over that process, this logo versus that logo. Those are all tactical pieces. There's, again, that the integration on the cultures and the people side of things, the institutional knowledge that sits between both. And usually it's the acquiring company that has, greater power, if you will, in that.
More bureaucracy because they're just like a bigger company and
And not sometimes they're the same size, but there's some dynamics. Like one of them is becoming the CEO of the entire company or the chair of the board and those kinds of things. So just thinking really about the people and how do you protect those. And the other is in doing due diligence and coming together to put together a business case to acquire or merge with another company. There are some business outcomes that they're projecting to be delivered. I sometimes don't see a single person that's on point for the synergy or integration benefits. And so it then gets so dispersed. And so come 2 or 3 years when the transactional activities are completed, they haven't realized the business benefit. And because they haven't held one or a small number of group accountable to delivering the outcomes that was in the original business case.
so speaking of that, do you kind of see a theme here between why a lot of these deals fail, and ultimately a lot of the times maybe the acquiring company has that short-term, initiative or short-term vision to accomplish a ton of stuff, and ultimately that leads to nothing getting done, as opposed to just kind of doing one simple thing well at a time?
Um, yeah, I think it's, um, I think there's not enough value placed on the people and on relationships. And so here, a personal example, for me is, so a number of years ago, an organization that I worked for, one of these publicly traded companies, sold the business that I was in to a private equity firm. And I was one of 50 executives who was under a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, for the sale of the business. It hadn't even been finalized. There were some different bidders. And the CEO of the global public company and the CEO of the company within that I was in came and delivered a message to us and asked us to go out into the market to clients and go to our teams with a very specific set of messaging around this. And on the second day after the transaction closed, the new CEO came and it was a very different message. You've just now compromised me, my integrity, and again, what you've asked me to deliver to and I was the executive sponsor for several of our largest clients. So I've assured them of this. I've gone back to my team and said something. And so now, I resigned. as a result of that. Or I've seen in another instance, and although I think they handled it again, this one will be a public one. When IBM acquired Red Hat, like Red Hatters were known to have a very, very unique culture, and that's part of the reason why they wanted to be there. And so they did a great thing in having Jim Whitehurst, who was the CEO of Red Hat, stay very embedded within IBM and try and carve them out for a period of time to make sure they felt integrated. So I thought that was smart, although it's years later and you see that sort of spread apart. So those are just things, again, going back to people and relationships that we're not thinking about enough. It's those transactional tactical items that are, on the checklist.
For sure. Those private equity deals are tricky. I do think that private equity could have a lot of benefit, but I think sometimes when the incentives are misaligned, unfortunately, some negative stuff happens. And I'm really sorry that you had to go through that.
Thank you.
So, speaking on a personal note, you actually have a book that is really intuitively titled called Influence Unleashed. That was perhaps maybe ahead of its time, even. So it's really centered around building a personal brand. And you're fortunate enough to have, a really big personal brand and to be a trusted voice. But there's also, for people that are trying to build a brand, a ton of competition out there. I mean, social media is so saturated and so flooded. So how can a person stand out, or how can we stand out and start to build our personal brands?
I think the mistake that many people make is they're focused on only one element of their personal brand. And I believe there's four main components. So the one everyone focuses on is your subject matter expertise. What do I do? Who do I do it for? And what industry maybe? So, but that's only one component. Recognize people do business with people they like and trust. And so then we have to build a much more holistic brand that is based upon the second foundational element is like your story. Who are you as a human? We interact as humans. Your your values, your passions, your interests, some stories that will build connection with people. So starting to share that. The next is, and it bleeds a little bit into number two, but is what makes you different from others. And as you said, it's saturated. There's lots of people out there. So when I'm working with people on their brand, I ask them to get incredibly clear around how are you different from others that do what you do. So, example for me, I said earlier, I'm radically candid. I tell people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. That is both who I am as an individual, but it's also a very big differentiator when working with me. And so, get really clear on those elements. And then the last one is around legacy and impact. What do you want to be known for? And this is one where at 25, you might not know, or I say that to my son as I talk to him about building his brand. So this one will evolve and change over time. For me, my definition of success and what I wanted to be known for in my 20s was probably much more around hierarchical achievement. So growing and going higher in an organization, material wealth and stature. None of that is the important stuff for me now. Legacy, I want to be known for leaving the the workplaces, the community, and the world a better place when I leave it than when I came in. And those are connected to number two for me, the values that I hold, being a great, leader, coach, and mentor, advocating for social justice and DEI, those kinds of things. So tell that holistic story and not just that first foundational element to have people like buy into who you are. And last one is just a caveat to those four is don't be all things to all people. Like not everyone's going to like you and get comfortable with that. Not everyone is going to buy your product or service or buy why you do. Again, going back to the Simon Sinek piece, you start with why. They're not going to buy why you do it. And that's okay.
There's a phrase, jack of all trades is master of none. So I definitely think that plays into your last one. And really candidly and selfishly, I was taking very diligent notes where you're saying that. I'm going to apply that to my life. So I always love when I can get some value out of this. But speaking about one of those, specifically about storytelling, because I have a belief that, a lot of major decisions, especially in corporate America, are made relatively informally. And I think that's kind of the black cat that nobody wants to mention. And while obviously you need to work hard and have great performance, I think a lot of the times, the unspoken vibe is, I think, what ultimately wins. And I think part of that unspoken vibe is telling a great story. So how can someone learn to tell a great story or become a great storyteller?
I think it's very, very important. Going back to sort of I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, but like I don't know if you've seen his viral original TED Talk. He talks about, that people buy what you like, why you're doing it, not what you're selling. And that needs to come with storytelling. So even when I think about when I work with my teams over, we're selling solutions to clients, it do it in a storytelling approach, so to bring people along the journey with them. And going back to my commenter, and like, people do business with people they like, trust, and want to do business with. Well, what starts to build some of that connection with people? That's storytelling, that's commonality, and none of that's going to come out unless you start to openly share it. So there's a guy actually that I for your listeners, I would encourage, and he provides all of this for free. I happened to meet him. I was a colleague when I was at IBM, Jeremy Connell Waite, hyphenated last name. And he actually helps IBMers tell stories, but he's been doing this for a multitude of different companies. And he's got some great ways in which he'll coach people on how to do that. And again, it's free content out there. But I can't say enough how critical I think that is in building relationships with people, whether it's because you want them to buy from you, or you want them to hire you, or you just want new friends and people in your life.
For sure. I'll definitely take a listen to that and appreciate you mentioning him. So to come a little bit full circle, right now you're working as primarily a speaker, a motivational speaker and a coach. Why do you do what you do?
That's been my long-term side hustle, and it will stay my side hustle. I'm in transition. I made a decision not to stay in management consulting, and go and find another C-suite career. Why do I choose to do it though? I love speaking. So when it comes to from a professional speaking standpoint, I was an actor when I was young. So standing on stage has always thrilled me. Although I was nervous as hell when I first had to start doing it with no character I was playing. Uh, I also shifted 10 years ago to doing it telling my story. As I've shared with you and your audience now, like, I wouldn't have done this so openly, but seeing it moves people, and that they can put themselves in their shoes, even if it's very different challenges that or adversity they've experienced, to motivate them to recognize you can move beyond that, or whether I'm talking about diversity and inclusion or leadership or whatever. So it inspires me to do it, and to, create movement with others. And on the coaching side, again, I will always continue to do that on a limited basis. I will maintain a C-suite job and do this. I love being able to impart some of my experiences and hopefully prevent some of the pain that I've experienced in my own personal or professional life with others. And again, like I said, I'm radically candid. Before I take any client on, I'm really clear. Like, it's gonna be difficult sometimes, and I'm gonna ask you questions and poke and prod at stuff that you might not want to, but to get you to a better place. And seeing them evolve makes me feel great. I remember taking a philosophy course in university and having a big debate over whether altruism actually exists. And it was Mother Teresa actually, like, altruistic. At the end of the day, I do feel good being able to help others. So I want to continue to make that a part of who I am and what I do on a day-to-day basis.
For sure. I love that. I think ultimately if we can do something, for a living that makes us feel good, I think ultimately that's one, the most sustainable approach for all our mental well-beings, but also I think a good way to look towards the future. And speaking about the future, just to round things out here on a parting note, we've talked a lot about work and a lot of different topics among the younger generation and corporate America and regarding your career. When you're thinking about the future of work, what are you most optimistic about?
Uh, I Your generation, as we talked a little bit earlier before, around the demands from the workforce for something very different in business. And I do not believe that it has to come with a trade-off for strong financial business performance. We can do more, do better as leaders in business, and create workplaces that we all enjoy working in. And I am excited, however, that what the work that gets left behind through all the automation and AI that's coming requires more of those kinds of skills and the kind of leadership that the newer generation's demanding of all of us.
For sure. I love that. And thanks for that answer. And Victoria, it's been a blast. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Victoria Pelletier. If you enjoyed the episode, rate the show on Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube, and subscribe.